All right, hello and welcome to this session on the 5 cognitive biases that are ruining your marketing and how you can go about fixing them. So we all love to get into a little bit of nitty-gritty behind how the brain actually works and all the stuff that's actually going on in here all the time, the behind the scenes stuff. But we tend to forget about how much sort of havoc it wrecks on all of your marketing and your marketing activities, and the way that it really gets in the way of people making decisions that are the right decisions for them, but also getting in the way of you getting the decision that you want effectively when it comes to your marketing materials. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into that. We're going to take a look at how bias actually works and get through into some of my favorite cognitive biases and the 5 ones that are really going to be ruining your marketing and giving you a hard time. Now, when it comes to what we're covering today, we've got some serious knowledge bombs that we're going to be dropping. So we're going to take a look at what bias actually is. We're going to judge the science behind bias. We're going to take a look at how you can figure out when bias is actually happening within your own processes and your own marketing. And then we're going to deep dive into those 5 biases. We're going to get into a little bit of fun behind the bias process and what you can actually do to control for those biases too. And then we're going to show you 4 things that you need to keep an eye on. So 4 specific areas that bias is definitely always going to be happening. So if those things are coming up in your marketing, you should be covering them off. And then what to do with it all. How can you control for that? And how can you make sure that your consumers are consciously making the right choice? And then I'll show you some next steps. Now, what's really important is as we get into this, it's not about manipulation. It's not about trying to trick people into making a decision that they wouldn't necessarily make, or manipulating them into a specific decision. What we're going to be talking today is about how you can help people make the right decisions, how you can help them stop falling foul of their own biases, and how you can stop your marketing from falling foul of those biases. So just keep that in mind as we go through that. So I'm Kenda MacDonald, and I am the founder of Automation Ninjas, and we're an agency that specializes in behavioral marketing automation. So when I founded this business, I was really clear that I wanted to help consumers and businesses understand how brains actually work and utilize that information to create really awesome marketing automation that converts really, really well. I also wrote the award-winning, and best-selling book, Hack the Buyer Brain, which is all about how we evolve to survive as a species, not necessarily to buy things online, and the implications that has for our marketing, because it has some pretty serious implications. And in doing that process, I took some of my background in forensic psychology and I pulled it through into the marketing automation process. But what I really do all day long is I create customer journeys. I help people understand this behavior and put them together in something that really works, and helps you get those conversions and those happy customers that stick around and spend longer with you, spending more money, because that's everything that we want as businesses, right? So it's a little bit of behavior and a lot of marketing automation all combined together. So that's what we're going to crack into today. My Twitter handles are down in the bottom right hand corner there. So please, if you want to get in contact and you want to hang out on social media, I do love a bit of Twitter. I love sparring with Paul on Twitter as well. Okay, so let's take a look at what cognitive bias is anyway. So cognitive bias is one of those things that you see in a lot of pop psychology. So you see a lot of people kind of bringing this up and being like, this is one really important thing that you should pay attention to. But really, when you dig it out, cognitive bias is a very boring definition. It's a systematic pattern of deviation from the norm or rationality in judgment. Okay, so that is the most boring thing you've probably ever read in your life. And what we can actually break that down to in human language is that cognitive bias is errors in the process of paying attention to the world around us. They're little corruption errors that get in the way of us making the right decisions. And they impact how we understand the world around us on a day-to-day basis. They're little mistakes that our brains are making. The problem for us as marketers or business owners comes in that the biases get involved in 3 very important parts of the process of your consumer actually buying from you. Biases get involved when we are thinking about stuff, just general thinking. Biases get involved when we understand things and how we understand the world around us. And biases get very heavily involved in decision making. So anytime we're having to do one of those three things, which is basically everything that a human does all day, every day, we're going to be affected by bias in some way or another. And that really makes us feel like brains are working against us at all times. And it's true, they are working against us, because at the end of the day, brains evolved to survive. They didn't evolve to do any of the complex decision making that we're currently doing. Humans as a species just happened to be the best species at doing this in the way that we're currently doing it. And we evolved a fantastic way to understand the world around us, and we became very, very highly cognitive beings. Now, to understand what bias really is and how that works against us, we have to take a look at how we understand the world around us and how we pay attention. And there were two brilliant dudes, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, who came up with our leading theory of how we pay attention to the world around us, how we understand the world around us. And they said there is a duality to attention. We understand the world around us using two systems. That's the only explanation possible for how we interact with the world around us. And because they're super inventive guys, they said that these systems are System 1 and System 2. They said that the main difference between the two is that System 1 is like a super fast system and System 2 is a super slow system. This led to their book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which explains the duality of attention and prospect theory, which is fantastic. It's a very difficult read, but I strongly suggest you have a look into it. And it also led to us understanding how cognitive bias came about. And they said that System 1 is so fast that it's basically automatic, and System 2 is so slow that it can be considered manual. And they like to call System 1 the autopilot and System 2 the pilot. That's how they refer to the two systems throughout the book. The main difference, now that we now understand 30 years on, or it was more than that, it's about 40 years on from when they actually proposed all of this, is we've had some pretty good insights in neuroscience in the last sort of 10 to 20 years. And we now understand that System 1 takes in around 11 million bits of information per second. That's a phenomenal amount of information that it's taking in to understand the world and to kind of get through everything on a day-to-day basis. However, System 2 can only take in around 40 bits of information per second. So it's really not a lot of information that it can take in. And the disparity in these two systems is quite phenomenal. And the only reason that System 1 can take in that much information is because it uses a series of rules and mental shortcuts to understand the world around us. That's that automatic approach that it has. Whereas System 2 is like really intensive and it's really effortful and it uses quite a large amount of calories to understand everything that's going on. Now, that's where the bias starts to creep in. But it gets confusing talking about System 1 and System 2. So let's get rid of all that stat stuff. And instead, I like to think of System 1 as the Minions and System 2 as Gru from Despicable Me. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, that's your homework. Go and watch that movie. But the main premise behind the movie is that we have this criminal mastermind over here. We have Gru. He's a very clever sausage. And, he has all these dastardly deeds and these things that he wants to be doing all the time. And so he either employs or enslaves this race of little yellow dudes with a variable amount of eyes, and they run around and they do the stuff, right? So they do all of the jobs. And the great thing about the Minions is that they're not very bright. That's the thing that makes the movie so funny. They're not the cleverest, but they can do one job and do one job very well. That's why Gru likes them so much. Because basically he can give one minion one job using a wrench or using a hammer or whatever the case is, and they will go off and they'll do that thing very, very well. So he can have hundreds or thousands of minions all working within the system, doing stuff very, very efficiently because that one minion is doing one thing and it looks after that thing. And the premise of the movie is basically this system just like totally getting wrecked by, the minions coming across stuff that isn't supposed to be their job or doing things and totally messing everything up. The fantastic thing about this is exactly how your brain works. It's like the perfect analogy for how the brain actually works on a day-to-day basis. We have lots of rules and mental shortcuts that help us understand the world around us and help us do specific things. But it's a one job, one minion kind of a deal. We have one rule for one specific thing. But that's okay because we have thousands of them in place. Whereas Gru, our System 2, our cognitive miser, our kind of overlord, our logical center of the brain, is very, very sort of limited in how much attention it can pay to stuff. And so it can do lots and lots of things. It can do complex decision making. It can understand the world around us in phenomenal ways, but it's only one of it. So the brain outsources most of its activities to the minions. Now, the problem with this is the fact that as marketers, as business owners, as people that are going out there and putting information in front of people and trying to affect the decision-making process, we like to think of our consumers as being this guru, this very clever, very cognitive, very in control overlord of everything. And we appeal to the guru in our audiences. Unfortunately, our brains only spend around 15% of the day in System 2. Because System 2 uses calories. We don't want to use calories. Using calories is bad for survival, so the brain is going to do absolutely everything that it can to not use System 2. Anything that can be outsourced to the minions is going to get outsourced to the minions. The minions are the gatekeeper to attention. They're the one that you need to be paying attention to the whole time. They're the ones you've got to be speaking to, because you're not going to get to Guru unless a minion has decided it is important enough to get past through System 1 to get to System 2. So we need to be focusing our marketing and our attentions on the minions. The problem with the minions is, of course, they're not very bright. They have very specific things that they are looking for, and they make mistakes. And the minions rule the brain. So if we want to get ahead and we want to make sure that our marketing is understood in the right way, we need to keep minions in mind. And these minions are going to be making mistakes. And if you fall foul of those mistakes, those cognitive biases, those corruptions that the minions are going to make, you're going to have a bad time with your marketing. So our mission is to always appeal to the minions, but to make sure that the minions make the right choices so that we can get through to System 2. And just remember all the time that having these rules, these systems and these processes in place is what is helping the brain save calories. So if you are asking the brain to utilize calories, you're going to have a bad time with it because the brain doesn't want to do that. So our effectivity and our structures and our processes and our biased nature is helping our brain save calories, which is exactly what the brain wants to do. And we don't want to make the brain work too hard. We want to understand that process. Now, the great thing about bias is that because our brain works, no matter our race, no matter our culture, no matter who we are, our brains all work in very, very similar ways because they're keyed to work in similar ways. So there are very small changes between races and between cultures in how the brain makes these corruption errors. And the great thing about this is it means that we know that there are hundreds of biases out there. We have lists of hundreds of biases where we make the same corruptions time and time again. We make the same errors time and time again. The minions screw up in the same way every single time. And that has given us massive insight into how the decision-making process continually gets corrupted. And so this is a fantastic it's just a fantastic drawing and compilation, the way that they've categorized this all together and designed this. So a dude called Buster Benson put this all together with some fabulous designers and came up with the Cognitive Bias Codex. Now, there are over 300 different cognitive biases that we have identified so far out there at this point in time. But we can broadly categorize them into 4 different areas. What we should remember, so anytime we have to remember or recall information, we will fall foul of bias. Times where there is too much information and we can't make sense of that information, we will fall foul of bias. When there is not enough meaning, so there is gaps in the information, we're going to fall foul of bias. And when we need to act fast and we need to make a decision quickly, we're going to fall foul of bias. So pretty much any of your waking moments, bias is going to be a part of the process. So we just need to be conscious of that. I'm not suggesting that you get into all 300 different biases, 300 plus, I think we're close to 400 now. I'm not suggesting that you get into that necessarily. I'm suggesting instead that you understand why bias happens and understand what to do about it to make sure that you're staying ahead of it. Although we are going to look at 5 specific ones because they're great. But when you break it down, it starts to look a bit like this, and you kind of want to hide under the table, right? I know when I look at this, there's too much information on this, which makes the bias in my own brain very unhappy, and I want to run away. But this is what happens when minions look after stuff, right? We're going to make lots of mistakes, and it's going to happen in lots of different ways. So bias is definitely going to happen, and it's going to happen anytime we have to remember stuff, and in particular with remembering stuff. There are specific biases that happen. So for instance, we edit and we reinforce memories after the fact. So we'll add things in that never happened in that specific thing. We'll add it in afterwards because now we have hindsight. So we add hindsight onto the actual memory, even though that isn't what happened in that moment. So we always reinforce stuff. We will do things like we'll discard specific information for general information. So you might have been given a really long list of things to do, but you'll genuinely remember, I need to tidy a specific room in the house, right? So the brain is always going to pare down the information to make sure that, we recall stuff and we don't utilize too much space. We'll always reduce events and lists to their key elements. So when you are giving people a long list of marketing materials or things that they need to remember, summarize it for them as well, because you want to control that outcome a little bit more. So we're always going to take a list and we'll always reduce it down. We store our memories differently based on how they were experienced. So two people can go through the exact same process, but if one, and twins as well, can go through the exact same thing, have every single same thing happen to them, but if they were in a bad mood beforehand, it's a bad memory. If they were in a good mood beforehand, it's a good memory. So we store our stuff differently based on how we experience that thing. And that's really hard for us as marketers to counter for that. How do you counter for the emotional impact of how an event was experienced? And then we have need to act fast. So anytime we need to do something quickly, we need to make a decision quickly, there are going to be some specific biases that are going to be happening. So for instance, in order to actually act, we need to be confident that the decision that we're going to make is important. If it's not important, the minions just ignore it. So if you want to get someone to do something quickly, you need to impart the importance of that decision onto that person. If we want to stay focused, we're always going to favor something that is immediate and that is relatable. So if you need somebody to do something quickly, help them understand how important that thing is and that it's relatable, and make sure that they can understand what's actually going on. We're always motivated to do things that we've already invested time in. So that's the sunk cost fallacy. So if we've sunk cost into something, we're always going to be motivated to complete that rather than letting it go and starting something new. And we're always motivated to sort of consistently hold on to our autonomy as a species. So if there is a little bit of status quo going on, we don't want to challenge that. We want to go with the status quo, but we also want to be individuals within that status quo. So don't push people too hard when you're trying to be revolutionary as a brand. And we're always going to favor stuff that's really simple and easy to action. So if you want to get people to do something fast, get them to understand how important it is. Get them to understand that it's easy to get it done. Get them to understand that everyone else is also doing that thing and that you are being an individual by doing that, which is such a juxtaposition of things. And also get them to understand that they can do it and they can do it easily, and they're not going to lose a lot of time by changing the way that they're doing it. So we have a lot that goes into the need to act fast. And then of course, when there is too much information, you're going to have a really bad time with bias. So for instance, this is the availability heuristic. If something is, has recently happened, we're going to be able to bring that up in our memory much faster. And anything that really stands out, that is bizarre, that is funny, that is novel, even anthropomorphic stuff, is stuff that sticks out in our memory. It doesn't get lost in all the other information because it's unique. And because it's unique, we can recall that information a lot easier. We'll also do things like if something's changed and something is different, we might not be able to put our finger on what is different, but we'll notice that it is different. That's a survival trait. And we're always going to be drawn to information if you've got lots of information, we'll be drawn to the information that confirms our own beliefs. We don't want to shake our beliefs too much. And we're going to notice flaws more easily in others than we will do in ourselves. Because we have so much information on ourselves, we don't have enough information on other people. So if there's lots of information out there, we're going to have a bad time with bias, because we're going to try and reduce the amount of information that we're using and pick out little bits. And that means, unfortunately, we don't make the right decisions. And then, of course, you have not enough meaning. So if there isn't meaning out there, if there isn't context, if there's gaps in information, bias is going to be really bad. And we'll do things like we'll find stories and patterns in data that don't exist. That's why we have lots of statistical validation, because that takes a human element out of it. So we like to kind of read into stuff that isn't actually there. We'll fill in sort of characteristics from stereotypes. We're really bad for stereotypes. It's how we understand the world around us. We'll bring in generalities and prior history, and we'll put information in that doesn't match, because we're trying to fill the gaps. gaps. We don't like having missing gaps in information. And we'll do this automatically. So you either give people complete information or you help them fill the gaps in a controlled way. But don't give them too little information. And we'll also do things like if we recognize someone, or someone seems like someone else that we really like, we'll be more fond of them even though we don't know them and they are a perfect stranger than we will for somebody who is a complete unknown. Which is why, for instance, if you go back and you sort of take a look at the Second World War, the people that are being put up and trialed 10 years ago for war crimes, because especially in the Nazi regime, who were being tried for war crimes because they were old and they looked like grandparents, people didn't want to give them as harsh sentences as they would for somebody who is much younger. So this can be a really bad bias for the criminal justice system. We like to simplify numbers and stuff as well, to make them easier to think about. And we also like to read into what we think other people are thinking and project our mindset onto past events and future events. So when there isn't enough meaning, we fill in the gaps in any which way that we can. So your job is to make sure that you do give enough meaning. So anytime these 4 things are going to come up, you're going to have bias. But let's take a look at some specific biases, some important biases. So these are the 5 different biases. Number 1 is when you make your own stuff. And this is called the IKEA effect, okay? And this is hilarious. Anytime that you make your own thing, so your own products, your own services, you assign a much higher value to it than is probably reasonable. And so the study that they did is they got a bunch of people together and they got them to build IKEA furniture. And then they got people to judge how much that furniture was worth now that it had been put together. Compared that to what the price is of the furniture, plus having like a master craftsman put it together. And then basically, what's the disparity in the amount of money that it actually is worth versus what people thought it was worth. And people consistently valued the stuff that they had created way higher, often ridiculously higher, than something that someone else had created. This is a real problem for when we are creating our own products and services. When we're creating our own stuff and we are selling it, we add way more value onto something than necessarily your audience might perceive. So the way that we combat this is to bring in some outside validation, some external validation, somebody else that can look at that and go, this is what I'd pay for that. So this is your opportunity to do a little survey, make sure that you're asking people how much would you actually pay for this product or this service, and get a feel for what the marketplace would spend on it, not how much you think it's worth, because very often you'll add a much higher worth onto it than anybody else. And if you suffer from imposter syndrome, by the way, this is also a great way to overcome imposter syndrome. Get some outside validation, because you'll do the opposite in imposter syndrome. You'll undervalue your stuff. So the IKEA effect is quite hilarious, but also when you're asking people to part with their money and their products and their services, be very, very aware of the fact that they may not want to spend or they may not want to part with it, and they may put a higher value on it than it is actually worth, because the IKEA effect is my favorite cognitive bias, but also one of those ones that's really prevalent in entrepreneurial circles. So watch out for that one. Then this is another brilliant bias, and this is such a great comic that goes along with it as well. And the comic says, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides, time to do my own research and find the real truth. And they're Googling a very hotly debated topic, and the result says literally the first link that agrees with what you already believe, and underneath it says completely supports your viewpoint without challenging it in any way. And the dude's like, jackpot. This is what we call confirmation bias, and this is exactly the case. So basically, people will listen and add more weighting to information that sort of conforms to their existing beliefs than anything that challenges what they currently hold. So this bias can be really, really dangerous when you're doing something like challenging the status quo. And because people are always going to favor stuff that confirms what they already believe, because it makes them feel good about themselves. And also it's information that they currently hold. So the problem with this is that if you're putting information out and you're saying, no, what you're doing isn't a good thing, or, what's currently happening isn't a good way of doing it, or in politics, this is a serious one. It really divides nations. I think America's having a bad time with this at the moment. Whatever you're doing, when it comes to the confirmation bias, you have to be very, very careful as to how you go about doing this. Because the way to fix or account for confirmation bias is to question assumptions. but you can't question other people's assumptions. If you question other people's assumptions openly, very few people will be open to that. And it's generally the open-minded people who aren't going to suffer from this too much that will be open to that. They will get defensive and they will shut down and they will double down on their confirmation bias. So the way to go about it instead is to get people to question their own assumptions. That's a difficult thing to do. Confirmation bias is probably one of the things that we face the most, but are the worst at handling because of the fact that this bias is so insidious. So what you need to do here is you get people to question their own assumptions, ask them questions, get them to answer them themselves, and get them to kind of form their own opinion by something through that questioning process. Confirmation bias tends to be the case that, you agree on something, you've created a specific rhetoric in your own head, and you're going through a specific set of motions without actually questioning any of that. When you get people to do things like, especially in media, question their news sources, question where information is coming from, question how they actually got to that point that they're at, people start to open up and they start to be able to take other pieces of information in. The other way that you can go about doing this is what I like to call the bait and switch. Give people the information that they are looking for and then help them see how that information isn't actually going to help them and what they should be looking for instead. But you've got to do it in a way that they own the outcome themselves. You cannot directly question that because otherwise the confirmation bias will shut down and people will double down on that defensively. So make sure that you get them to question their own processes and go through that structure themselves. That's the way to get around that very, very insidious effect. Very, very bad for your marketing, especially when you're challenging the status quo. My suggestion is to borrow from other things that they already know and then get them to kind of have their own process that they're going through, but you carefully control that process. The next one is something I do quite frequently. So the meme for this one is hearing noise in the dark after watching a horror movie, it's definitely a serial killer. And this is what we call the availability heuristic. And that is when you have different types of information available to you. So you will always sort of draw on the one that is most recent. So in this example, this parrot has watched a horror movie. They've heard some noise in the dark. They've connected the two things together. It's definitely a serial killer. If you got them to watch something else, like maybe a documentary about mouse infestations or about the plague or something like that, they'd probably think that that noise was a mouse. You can control how people perceive things around them by the thing that they saw last. And this is purely because we're really easily influenced by information that is recently available in the brain. The stuff that is recently available in the brain, we give more weighting to, even though it might not be the correct information, or the right information, or the stuff that makes the most logical sense. We're just going to take the thing that's the most recent because that's easy, and the minions are a little bit lazy. And we like to think that this is the most vivid thing, this is the most important piece of information. It's just because it was right then and there. So what tends to happen with this is if you have seen an advert or something recently, when you get asked to buy a product or service, you're more likely to buy the product or service for the advert that you have seen recently. Not the one that you are the most favorable towards, but the one that is most recent in memory. And that can be really, really serious for your marketing efforts because that's not what you want to do. You don't want people to just buy something because they saw the competition recently. So what we want to do instead is we want to make sure that we counter this by making yourself available, making the information available that you want them to have available when you are asking them to make the decision. Now, the best way to go about this, and the advertising industry does this really well, Coca-Cola and stuff advertise even though they don't need to advertise. They advertise anyway to make sure that people are keeping them top of mind, right? That's why Coca-Cola spends so much money on advertising to effectively sort of take advantage of the availability heuristic. There's a great way that you can do this, and that is through content marketing, by consistently showing up, adding value all the time, being there consistently so that when people make their decision, you're the one that they think of. But the other thing that you can do is a great copywriting tactic where you have 3 specific things that you get people to do. So you tell people, I'm going to tell you this information. You give them the information and then you tell them what you have just told them. Okay, so now the information is really readily available in their minds. So when you ask them for the decision, it's much more likely that they're going to go down that route. So tell them what you're going to tell them the thing, and then tell them that you've just told them that thing. You're making your information a lot more available. But also, if you're asking people to make a decision, remind them of the stuff that you have originally told them. Okay, so make that information more readily available. So show up more, show up consistently, add value, make sure that you are consistently repeating and getting those repeatable messages, those sticky messages, and you'll be a lot more available. Otherwise, your competition will do this, and that means that they're going to be the most available and they're going to get the decision. That's not what you want. And then number 4 is we've got the framing effect. Now the framing effect is great. I absolutely love this. And as we can see in the image here, we've got frozen yogurt at 20% fat and frozen yogurt at 80% fat free. People always choose the 80% fat free because it's framed much nicer. So basically our decisions are just influenced massively as to how the information is actually presented. So if you present it in a way that somebody actually wants it, they're going to go for that choice even if it's the exact same thing. These 2 pots of frozen yogurt are exactly the same. Both of them are 80% fat free and 20% fat full. But we don't like the idea of the 20% fat if we are trying to lose weight. We like the idea of it being 80% fat free. It sounds better. And what they've done in the way that they've put this information together is they've framed it nicely. So if you can control the frame around something, that means people are more likely to go for that product or service. So your job here is to make sure that you are controlling that frame, that you are putting things together in a nice way that makes people actually want that. To do this, you need to understand what it is that people want. If you don't understand what it is that your target audience wants or what they're interested in, you won't be able to control the frame appropriately. Remember, the minions are lazy. They're just going to go with whatever's happening. They're going to go for the shortest, the easiest route. So you control that shortest and easiest route by controlling the frame around them. Really, really effective way, very, very commonly used as marketing. Frame it in such a way that it sounds appealing to what your audience actually wants. And then you're going to have a winner. All right, and then we are on to something that you see happening in media quite often. I love this cartoon. It says, we need some new jargon. The public are starting to understand what we're talking about. This is what we call the curse of knowledge. Okay, obviously they're using it here to be super manipulative and keep people in the dark. But the curse of knowledge is basically the fact that as individuals, and this is something that's a curse for us, not necessarily for our audience, it's definitely a curse for us as marketers, for us as business owners. This is a cognitive bias that basically happens when you're an expert. You know a lot of stuff, which means that you talk in such a way that your audience doesn't understand what you are saying. And if it's not easy to understand, it doesn't match what the minions are looking for, your minions aren't going to pay attention and it's never going to get up to system 2. You're never going to get that active attention and you won't get the right decision. So we very often unknowingly assume that our audience knows more than they actually know because we take for granted the fact that we are experts. We know what we're talking about. We do this all day, every day. So we make it difficult for our consumers, our audience to understand what it is that we actually do. We make it difficult for people to understand how that product or that service is going to benefit them. And we just all around make it difficult for people to make the right decision. So the curse of knowledge is something that is probably one of the worst ones that I see. I see businesses do this consistently, communicate in such a way that leaves a high barrier for people actually being able to understand what you are saying. So the way that you do this, or you get around this, is to just be aware of awareness. So beware awareness all the time. So be really clear on where your consumer is in their journey. What information are they looking for? What level do they understand things at? It's not about talking to something that you're comfortable with. It's about talking to a level that they are comfortable with. If you can get really clear what it is they need to know right now, and talk to them in a way that they will understand, you will always make sure that you're not falling foul of the curse of knowledge. And just double check, am I making it difficult in the way that I'm talking? Am I utilizing a massive amount of industry jargon? I see people's tweets and people's stuff all the time where they've used acronyms and they've shortenings and that kind of stuff, which makes total sense, maybe in your industry or in your niche. It doesn't make sense to everyone else around you. And if the minions can't understand it, they filter it out because it's not important. So we want to make sure that we're always aware of the awareness level of your audience, and that we're keying into how they want to be spoken to. Make it easy for them to understand, and you're going to have a good time. So with all of these biases, we want to shortcut the minions. And the way that you shortcut the minions is you meet them where they are right now. Meet them at their level. It's nothing to do with your level. It's everything to do with where they are, what they are interested in, what they're going to consume, and how you can consistently be communicating on a minion level. Now, when bias is happening, there are specific things that you can do to help. There are 4 scenarios you can ask yourself these questions, to make sure that your audience isn't in a bias level, just to make sure that you're really, really clear. I'm going to help at these situations. So for instance, if there is some kind of incentive involved, if somebody is going to do something and they're going to get some kind of reward for it, if they're going to get some kind of specific thing, bias is going to get involved, because we're always going to favor the short-term rewards over the long-term stuff. If the choice is going to be difficult, bias is definitely going to get involved, because we will sort of accidentally substitute an easier decision for a harder decision. So we'll change the question a little bit and answer it slightly differently to make it easier for us to understand and make the wrong choice. If the option isn't happening frequently for your target audience, you have to get involved with a lot of content, because otherwise your audience is going to be making the wrong decision. And if there is little understanding of the effects of any kind of consequence out there, bias is definitely going to get involved. So those are some questions that you can ask yourself, and then be really conscious of how you go about actually making that information available, and answering bias in such a way that you're helping people make the right decisions. So in terms of actually making bias go away, there are 3 things that you can do. The first is that you can provide something that is super, super tangible. If you can make something really obviously the right choice, if you can make it easy to understand, the autopilot or the minions will favor that. They will always favor action for something that is really tangible, that they can understand, that is clear, that is concise. So your mission is always to be talking at that level, to make things really tangible. The second is, if you can give an immediate reward, if you can give an immediate thing versus a long-term one, always go for immediate. Now, it might be that you work in the long-term industry. I know I do. Customer journeys aren't something that happen overnight. So what can you do to give people a quick win in the meantime? What immediacy can you give them to help them get through that long-term time period? So make sure you give the minions something immediate, because they will always opt for the short-term rewards over the long-term ones. And then the third one is certainty. Minions hate uncertainty. They won't make any decision at all in the face of uncertainty. They will ignore the decision and they'll run away and hide. So they're always going to take a certain choice over an uncertain or a risky choice. That doesn't mean that your products or services or your things might not be a risk, but help them understand what the risk is. Help them get some certainty as to, okay, I know that this might be risky, but I also know that these might be the rewards, and that I'm more likely to get the rewards than I am to get the risk. Or whatever the case is, help give them that certainty that they are making the right decision, even if you can't mitigate the risk from the decision itself. I know that there's risk involved in this decision, but I'm making this decision because it's the right choice for me to make. Get them being certain in something. You give them that certainty, you give them immediacy, you give them tangibility. That is always going to help reduce the biases. It's always going to help you get really clear on how you can get them to that next step. So, when we are faced with bias, the best thing that we can always do is combat it with content. This is why content marketing works so very well. But it's also about taking a look at your content itself and going, okay, I am writing this amazing content. I'm creating these amazing ads. I'm creating this fabulous ad collateral, these videos, these jingles, these things, all this amazing stuff. Take a look at that and drill down into the detail of that content and go, okay, I've got these things, but how do I make sure that I'm giving that immediacy? I'm giving that tangibility. I'm making things certain. I'm aware of the fact that there might be bias in all things. Drill down into that content and make sure that you're making it approachable for the minions, because you're talking to the minions, not to Gru. Okay, so now in rounding up, we always need to make sure that if there's something to remember, if there is a need for a quick decision, if there is too much information, or if there's not enough meaning, so too little information, bias is going to get involved. It's going to happen if one of those 4 things are there. So what we need to be focusing on is give the minions that tangibility, give them that immediacy, and give them that certainty. And if you can do that, you can always make sure that you are doing the very best that you can to ward off a little bit of bias. And it will also make sure that your messaging is clearer, it's easier to understand, it's going to be more available, therefore the next time round it will be more vivid and it will be better stored in memory. So even if you're not just focusing on really getting rid of that bias and understanding it, then you're at least making sure that that is minion friendly, which means that your marketing is going to be more effective. All right, so that is what you need to be focusing. But if you want to get more into the nitty-gritty bits and the details, then this is what I wrote Hack the Buyer Brain about. It's all about, the processes that we go through and the sort of psychology and the neuroscience behind the marketing process, so behind the lifecycle marketing framework, behind how you build a customer journey, behind how you get customers, keep them, and get them sticking around for longer. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, that's what the book is about. And if you have any questions on bias and you want to pick my brains, by all means, that's my email. I love getting emails from you guys. It makes me very excited. And if you want to have a chat, we have free 15-minute chats, which you can go and have a look at there. But yeah, just make sure that you're constantly catering always to the minions, keep them happy, and they will flag the information up and they will pass it up to Guru, who will make the end decision. But make sure that you don't fall foul of bias. And I'm very excited to see what you're going to be doing as you're warding off your biases.